Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Inclusive Dev Chat. My name is Andrea Pregel, and I am the co-founder of the Global Observatory for Inclusion, also known as GLOBI. GLOBI is a non-profit organization and also an online platform which brings together advocates and experts from all over the world to discuss and share ideas and learnings and opinions on the theme of social inclusion. Today, we'll launch a new initiative called #InclusiveDevChat, which basically, Inclusive Dev stands for Inclusive Development and basically refers to the inclusion of all people, including those who are traditionally marginalized and left behind and vulnerable, within the Sustainable Development Agenda. Before introducing the specific topic for today, however, I would like to introduce the panelists. Dawa, would you like to start? Would you like to introduce yourself, Dawa?
Hello, good evening, everyone. It's 6 p.m., nearly 6 p.m. here, so it's good evening. My name is Dawa Dukpa, and I teach at the Royal University of Bhutan, in Bhutan, and I'm based in Paro, Bhutan. Yep, thank you.
Leda?
Hello, everyone. I am Leda Kamenopoulou, and I'm a senior lecturer in special and inclusive education at the University of Roehampton in London.
Thank you, Leda. Joyce?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Joycelyn Azueta, originally from the country of Belize, recently moved and now living in the Philippines and about to work in an inclusive international school, Everest Academy.
Rolando?
Hi, everyone. My name is Rolando Jr. I'm from the Philippines, but I'm now based in Kenya, working as expert on mission and inclusive education at UNICEF Kenya.
Brilliant. And I just realized I haven't properly introduced myself. So I'm actually from Italy, but I'm currently based in the UK where I work for Science Savers. Great. So the specific topic for our conversation today is basically inspired by a book that was recently published. And all the panelists today have co-authored or authored chapters in this book. The title of this book, and I've got a copy here with me, is Inclusive Education and Disability in the Global South, and it was edited by Leda Kamenopoulou. She will give an introduction to the book, and then after the introduction on the book, each panelist will basically present some of the key results and the key observations emerging from their research. Leda, would you like to maybe say a few words about the book?
Yes, as you said, the book is focused on inclusive education and disability in what we call Global South. And I'd like to say a bit about the reason why we thought this book is necessary. As you know, and the panelists know, there has been a lot of talk, a lot of discourses around inclusive education and disabled people's rights since even the 90s, since the Salamanca Statement, but especially more recently since the UN Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. There has been a lot of talk across the Global South and North about inclusive education and the need for inclusive education. However, despite that, there is very little is known about the Global South, inclusive education and disability in the Global South, and especially voices from the Global South are missing from the literature. And because in this, we felt that this research that was included in this book, the research studies included in this book, were breaking new ground in this sense. And this is why we felt it was necessary to put them together in an edited volume and disseminate this very important groundbreaking research more widely. So that's a little bit about the rationale behind the book. I'll say a little bit more about the chapters later on, if that's okay. Yeah?
Sure. I just wanted to mention that the book is published by Palgrave Macmillan. I will add, there will be a link at the bottom of the video. So anyone who is interested in knowing more about the book, they can just follow the link. Shall we maybe go into the specific studies and have a bit of an overview of each chapter?
Shall I start with chapter 1?
Sure.
So chapter 1 is the introductory chapter, which I authored, and it offers an explanation of basic terms. So readers will find things like what is inclusive education, what is special education, what is the link between the two, and what is disability, what is special educational need, and also what is global south, what is global north, because these terms are not straightforward. So the first chapter would provide someone interested in the topic with a lot of basic information and a lot of literature. So one can go to chapter 1 to read what is known about inclusive education and disability in the global south, who are the key authors, what are the key sources and journals. So in this sense, chapter 1 sets the context of the book and provides the readers with a lot of background information as well as clarification of key terms. And there's also a brief overview of all chapters at the end of chapter 1, so one can also very quickly see a summary of each of the chapters at the end of chapter 1. I think that the most important argument of chapter 1 is that all knowledge, almost all knowledge we have that has been collected about the global south has not come from global south researchers or global south based researchers. And I argue in this chapter that the field is dominated by global north-based researchers. So in this sense, this book was necessary because all the authors were doing research, qualitative research within the context, and some of that they were researching, and some of the authors were already coming from this context. So they knew a lot about the context that they were researching. And in this sense, the book is quite unique because it captures voices from the global south that have not been captured before.
Thank you, Leda. I think that's very helpful, and it sets a good overview of the book. And so the first chapter provides a nice overview of all the following chapters and all the themes that will be then discussed throughout the whole book.
Can I just say one last thing? Sorry to what is different. The readers might be interested to know what is different about this book. It's three things. First of all, it's as I said, collection of countries, of voices from countries of the global south on which very little is known. Also, these studies were small-scale qualitative research studies, which needed to be disseminated further. The findings needed to go further. And the last thing is that it's research conducted by education professionals plus postgraduate students. So it was practitioners doing further academic work in this context. So I think that's very unique about this book.
Thank you, Leda. I think it'd be useful to now get a bit more in depth into each of the chapters. We don't need to follow maybe the order of the book. We can, anyone who wants to start and go first and talk about their study and the results. Go on.
Okay, the study presented in my chapter explored the perspectives of teachers working with students with visual impairment in mainstream schools in Belize. Although Belize has adopted a policy on inclusive education, there is failure when it comes to policy being translated into practice. Moreover, although we have signed and ratified international conventions such as the Conventions of the Rights of the Child and Conventions of Persons with Disability, unavailability of effective practices to meet the needs of these children in mainstream schools is very evident. Therefore, I decided to conduct a qualitative study using 8 teachers from 6 selected schools across different regions in Belize. So I used 6 districts in Belize. So unlike the Philippines that has provinces, we have districts. The main findings revealed in the study were that teachers were very open to the idea of inclusion and perceive inclusion as equal opportunity for children to access education through mainstream schools. Although they were very open to the idea and acknowledged that being in an inclusive setting can yield benefits for children in social skills and independent life skills, teachers were very vocal in expressing the challenges that they encountered working with these children. Specifically, they were very vocal in recognizing the lack of training in the field of special education. Furthermore, these teachers expressed the lack of knowledge in Braille, which they found was very essential to work with these children, specifically children who came from rural communities. Moreover, the teachers expressed the lack of resources, both human and physical resources. They expressed the lack of funding that some of the schools have are exposed to in the rural areas. They were a bit, I would say, angry at the fact that the government does not place enough funding in the rural remote schools. Secondly, teachers were also very expressive when it came to parental involvement. They expressed that if parents would be more involved in early childhood and were active in providing early years stimulation, then children who have visual impairment would have better orientation and mobility skills, which they were able to observe was also a challenge because these children came from homes where parents did not provide support at the end of their day, specifically in practicing Braille. So these were some of the concerns that the teachers presented. Overall, they believe that inclusion is the way to go in Belize, and that more and more teachers are becoming embracive of the idea, but they were also able to express that teachers can be more pro-inclusion if they receive proper training to develop their teacher competencies. So I think that in Belize, it is gaining more awareness. Teachers are becoming more aware. And I was fortunate enough to have had an opportunity to go back to my country. I spent some months working with pre-service teachers and in-service teachers and giving them some more knowledge in terms of how they can work in helping these children with disabilities, not only in the area of visual impairment and sensory impairment, but just on a whole for them to get more knowledge on what special education and inclusion is.
Thank you very much, Joyce. That's really, really useful, and it's a very good overview of the study you've done. We'll have time for discussion and questions and maybe some...
I wanted to just say one thing about what Joyce, the first point Joyce made, the lack of teacher training. It was astonishing, for example, that one of the findings was that there was only one teacher training teachers on Braille in the whole of Belize, and that person was based in Belize City. So you can imagine how challenging for rural areas the situation becomes if there is no one available to train teachers on Braille. So I found that an astonishing finding. So,
currently, that was in 2015. The good news is that presently there are more teachers getting knowledge and exposure to Braille. So that's a very good recent news from that side.
Great, thank you. Dawa, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you. So our study, our research, we wanted to find out how people in Bhutan understand or conceptualize disability and inclusion. So our study, our data, our data was, we made our data more, or we try to include people from different walks of life in our data. For instance, we have only 15 people, but all those people are maybe 30% are teachers, but others are, we had from different walks of life. We have monks, we had parliamentarians, we had doctors and other people also. So we try to make it more representative of how people in general understand disability and inclusion. And qualitative research, and our finding points out that people in general, people in Bhutan in general, they understand or they conceptualize disability more from medical model perspective. In the sense, they point to things like people are disabled because there's something wrong within them. It's because of an impairment, or sometimes they also say maybe because they also blame their parents, sometimes saying because of the parents' behavior, children are born disabled. And also one interesting finding from our research, I would say it is more contextual based, is that some of our participants shared that disability is a result of past karma or fate, which is more, I think I would say, cultural and more based on their religious beliefs. And yeah, so I think that was quite interesting. And the other thing was like people also thought that looked at people with disability, persons with disabilities through more patronizing lens. They said oh, they are disabled people, we should help them, we should give them food, or we should they don't really talk about their right, but more on helping those people. So from our research we found out that these are some of the interesting findings. And yeah, I think I will talk about it when you get back to it. Or
Thank you,
questions.
Dawa. I saw people when you were speaking. I saw people nodding, so I know that your research and your findings are very specific to the context of Bhutan. But I also suspect that the other panelists probably had similar experiences in different contexts. So maybe we will be able to talk about it at the end. So there will be time for a brief conversation and some questions and answers. Rolando, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much, Andrea. From Bhutan, we'll go straight to the Philippines. And our research study was focused more on how mainstream primary school teachers in one of the provinces in the Philippines made an attempt to modify their assessment strategies for children with disabilities. And just to highlight this chapter, I'd like to focus on some very important points. One is that what makes this study interesting is the fact that building on what Leda said a while ago, that there's so much emphasis on knowledge in the global north. In the Philippine context, a lot of studies on disability and inclusive education are also focused in the Imperial Manila, which is the capital city. And one very important point of this study is that it was conducted in one of the poorest provinces in the Philippines, specifically from the central part of the Philippines. So this puts that region into the spotlight of hearing the stories and voices of teachers and how they work with children with disabilities in the regular classrooms. The second highlight I would like to point out is it was very interesting because the schools that we chose for the study were overwhelmingly schools coming from rural contexts. And a lot of these schools don't have enough resources in terms of well-ventilated classrooms. You know, these classrooms and even the teachers themselves don't have enough assistive devices, visual aids to work with children with disabilities. But what was fascinating with this study is that amidst the scarcity of resources, these teachers made an attempt to innovate and to tap on their creativity to work with children with disabilities. And to be specific, the teachers made an attempt on how they modify the strategies, assessment strategies for children with disabilities. For instance, there was a teacher who made an attempt to modify the length of the assessment or examination for a child with intellectual disability. So instead of following the very strict guideline of having 60 minutes for every child to do an examination, the teacher made an attempt to extend the time frame in order for the child with intellectual disability to work on the assessment. There was also an interesting practice among the teachers about how they sort of use peer support in the classroom, tapping other pupils or other students' capacities and potentials to work with children with disabilities. For instance, there was a teacher who loved working with children without disabilities to work with children with disabilities on certain tasks. So for instance, there was a case of a group work or an activity in the classroom. So instead of putting children to do an individual work, the teacher encouraged children to work with other peers to accomplish the assessment. So those are some of the specific examples of the study, of the highlights of the study. But I think one thing that we would like to highlight in this chapter is, you know, there's so much discussion and resistance against inclusive education because a lot of people think that it doesn't work in contexts where there is scarcity of resources. But I think this chapter argues that if teachers have the commitment and have the willingness and have the support to work with children with disabilities amid scarcity of resources, they can tap on their creativity and innovation to work with children with disabilities. And those are some of the things that we have in the chapter on assessment strategies for children with disabilities.
Thank you very much, Rolando. Very good as always. And I think I can see very good points there, which also overlap with some of the things that other panelists discussed before. Perhaps I could go next and then I'll pass the mic to Leda for the final chapter, if that's okay. So the research we conducted in Malaysia was basically conducted in the island of Penang, and it's a qualitative study. We conducted in-depth, semi-structured interviews and also observations in the field. And the focus of the chapter, the focus of the study was on basically the interplay of deafness and ethnicity in the development of the sense of identity of people who are deaf and belong to minority ethnic groups in the context of Malaysia. Malaysia has a multicultural society with a number of different ethnic groups. The main groups are Malays, Chinese, Indians, and there is a huge number of small minority groups. And so the question we asked was, people who are deaf and also belong to one of these groups, how do they develop their sense of identity, and what are the experiences within the family, within school, within society, and within the deaf community and the ethnic communities? How do all this overlaps, and where how do they develop their sense of identity, and how do they participate in society. The results of the study are quite interesting. First of all, this was the first study ever conducted on this topic in Malaysia. Similar studies have been conducted before, for example, in the US with the Native Americans, deaf Native Americans, and Black deaf people. In the UK with people from Pakistani origins, deaf people from Pakistani origins. In New Zealand with deaf Maoris. But this was the first study on this topic in Malaysia. And what we found out was that basically it was a very postmodern reality, the one we encountered, because all the people we interviewed, and also based on the results from the observations, we realized that people developed a very fluid sense of identity. They didn't pick and choose one identity over the other, but they negotiated their different and multiple identities depending on the context and the situation. However, all participants we interviewed expressed their sort of connection with both their deaf identity and the deaf community, as well as their connection with their ethnic background and people belonging to the same ethnic group. They didn't see them in competition. However, based on the interviews and the observations, we found out that the deaf part of their identity was prevalent in shaping basically their life. And that's because of the issues related with communication. For example, within the family, all the participants we interviewed had enormous challenges in communicating with their families, who in most cases didn't want to learn sign language. All the participants considered Malaysian Sign Language as their native language, but they couldn't really communicate at home. And the same thing happened within schools until all participants ended up going to deaf schools, which are schools for deaf people, and that's where they learn sign language, and that's where they felt included. And before that, in all the mainstream educational environments, they all often felt left behind, which of course raises a huge number of questions in terms of what is the most appropriate setting, but also what are the resources and how are the investments made to make mainstream schools more accessible? Because even in the deaf schools, for example, we found out that only very few teachers were actually deaf teachers. So it was a deaf school with hearing teachers, which is quite uncommon as well. So overall, there's a number of results are included in the chapter, but I think overall the interesting aspect was that deafness and the access to communication had a huge impact on the life of these people, and so it was in a way the factor which contributed the most in shaping their sense of identity and belonging in the community. So that was for our chapter from Malaysia. Leda, would you like to give maybe a brief overview of the last chapter, and then we can raise some questions and see whether there's any overlapping theme and if there's anything that can be replicated across different areas and contexts?
Mm-hmm. So the last chapter is the conclusive chapter. The aim of the chapter was to offer a critical discussion of key themes emerging from the 4 studies presented in the book, and to outline lessons learned from the research presented. There are at the end of the chapter specific recommendations as well, primarily for research, but also with implications for policy and practice. So when I was starting to think about that last chapter and going through all the rest of the chapters in order to identify some common themes, I very quickly noticed that there was a distinction between themes that were entirely context specific. So, for example, the understanding of disability influenced by religious and philosophical beliefs in Bhutan, that was a very context-specific finding. Or, for example, the extreme poverty, lack of resources that we found in the Philippines. So I was noticing that some themes were context-specific, whereas others seemed to fall under a more generic category. For example, the contradiction between rhetoric and reality, which is the contradiction between policy and practice. The lack of teacher training. These are themes that those people who are familiar with literature, inclusive education, and disability, they will recognize from other contexts. So I started to wonder, to play around with this idea of context-specific, whereas generic themes. And I came up with I developed a theoretical framework, a tool, if you like, which I think is useful for researchers looking at inclusive education in the Global South and beyond. So I named some issues, topics as generic or universal themes you would expect to find in more than one context, like, for example, the expectation that every child has a right to education. This is something that should apply universally. Do you see what I mean? On the other hand, what I named singulars are concepts or issues that would only seem to apply to specific contexts. And using this tool, the main argument of the book is that we can be empowered to produce more qualitative research, because this type of research is able to capture the subtleties of different contexts. So through this tool, researchers could justify using more qualitative research to capture voices from under-researched contexts. That was more or less the main argument of the last chapter. And I did stress there that the way all of the research was done, all of the research presented in the book was done, was structured, and also very reflective. So none of the researchers just went to the context, collected data, and came, back to the global north, if you like, to write it up. There was involvement with the context. There were relationships developed with participants, and there was a very reflective and sensitive approach, which I felt was the appropriate one for capturing participants' voices rather than imposing our voices to the context. So that was another thing that was stressed. In terms of the to conclude, in terms of the recommendations for research, the suggestion is that more qualitative research is needed, because this allows both the collection of information of more generic themes, but also allows the exploration of very context-specific issues. And the final recommendation is to do with how we empower local researchers from the Global South, and how we empower them to produce more projects and more research that captures the voices of the local people. So that was the conclusive chapter in a few words, and I think it leads us very smoothly to our discussion, because I feel that we can talk more about this divide between the distinction between generic and context-specific themes, and how I'd like to hear how the rest of the authors see this distinction. What your thoughts are on this?
Thank you very much, Leda. I think that's a very good overview, and it's a nice bridge to some good questions, and we can see from the panelists what they think about it. And I know that probably Rolando would need to leave us in a few minutes, so maybe Rolando, would you like to go first and tell us what you think about this opportunity to replicate some of these learnings, some of these studies, and also what is the level of replicability and applicability of these learnings elsewhere?
Yeah, no, I want to build up what Dawa has mentioned a while ago about, and also building up to what Leda mentioned about context specific on this karma thing. And I think we were nodding when Dawa was talking about how the Bhutanese society looks at disability as more of a curse, sort of like that. I think in the Philippines and even in Kenyan context, it's also common where, in the Philippines, for instance, if a mother has a child with disability, people would say, "Oh, you've sinned. You sinned before. That's why God punishes you." So there's also that there's also that applicability of that situation in Bhutan to other contexts. But I want to highlight, Andrea, how, after doing the research, I provided a copy to the Department of Education of my thesis. And what was powerful about that gesture was that the Department of Education, specifically in the Negros Oriental province, took the initiative of building the experiences of the teachers involved in the research and made them more of like people who can share their experiences to other regular teachers. And that led to a very good support group where teachers can have their conversations on their experiences in the classrooms in terms of how they practice inclusion. So I think this is the power of doing these researches. And again, the challenge for all of us is how to bring these findings to the local communities and make people understand the importance and relevance of these findings. Because from my experience, when the Department of Education knew how important and how some teachers innovated to work with children with disabilities, they were so interested to replicate these practices and inspire other regular teachers. I'm not talking about special teachers, but regular primary schools teachers to work with children with disabilities. So that's the beauty of spreading these words to local communities and empower them to create their own system to further support the good findings from the research.
I think that's a brilliant example of how research can also be linked, as Leda was saying, to policy and practice. And what I think is great about the research you conducted is that all panelists more or less talked about the lack of resources and the lack of training, etc. But what you find out in your research is there are solutions, there are approaches, and often teachers themselves are very willing to try and be more inclusive and provide a more accessible instruction and education, and provide education within a more inclusive environment. And what I think your study does provides an example of how that can be done, and the fact that now the government is trying to replicate that and trying to use these findings to see what can be replicated elsewhere in the area. I think that's just brilliant.
Absolutely, Andrea. And one last thing. I think the misconception of inclusive education, when we talk about children with disabilities, is that people associate it with specialist teachers. And you see a lot of policies, discussions, and everything about inclusion and disability. You always see specialist teachers on the table. Where are the primary school teachers? And I think this is one of the powerful things that the study in this chapter highlights, is that if we want ownership in terms of inclusive education, we need to hear the voices of regular primary school teachers, not just specialist teachers. And this is a challenge for governments and for all of us to bring the voices of primary school teachers onto the table and hear their experiences. At the end of the day, inclusion is all about regular schools. And if we want to turn that over to regular schools, we need to empower these regular school teachers. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rolando. Joyce, would you like to add to that and maybe try to respond to Leda's question?
Well, in light of what Leda discussed in the last chapter, and with what Rolando was able to share, how can we apply the findings in your own context? And for example, prior to doing the research, I know when I had the face-to-face interview with the teachers, one specific teacher shared with me and said that they have always been afraid to share their opinions and their feelings about the challenges that they encounter in schools, specifically in remote schools where there is not much emphasis given to these children. So I think that in my case, my study was able to provide a platform for teachers to become more expressive and more vocal about their desire and their owners to want to become trained and not to depend on the government or on the administrators to give them these trainings. But teachers have recognized that they have to have the willingness to want to work with these children in regular schools. So when Rolando expressed that in the Philippines, the teachers have very high willingness. Now that I am here living and having had an experience to volunteer and work with organizations like Teach for the Philippines, I had the opportunity to work with the public school teachers in primary school. And I was so impressed, Rolando, to see the drive and the willingness and the innovation that teachers in the Philippines have to work with children from all different backgrounds. Children that come from very poor homes, children that come from poverty-stricken neighborhoods, and children that come from families that are not themselves educated. So I believe that that can be something that all other contexts and countries can adapt, that desire. Teachers should have that openness and willingness to want to work and improve themselves, not just depend on specialists or trainers to give them that knowledge.
Yeah, can I add to that and say that perhaps what came out, because I was also looking at the findings of the research in the Philippines, and these three teachers that were part of the sample were extremely motivated, and as Rolando said, Rolando, so creative and so innovative. It seemed that it seemed a little bit too much to require, of all teachers without appropriate support to be willing to invest their own time, because this is what we saw in the Philippines research, that they were doing things in their own time, adapting resources, etc. I think that that perhaps the attitudes could be made more positive, with more raising awareness around inclusive education rather than specialized training and special strategies, because the teachers in Belize, they were angry, as you said, because of lack of support. They said we can inclusion is achievable, but with the right resources. That's what they said. However, if there is perhaps more like a more general raising of awareness around inclusive education, maybe primary and secondary mainstream school teachers are going to start feeling more positive about it, despite the lack of training and support. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Dawa, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think when I listen to Leda, Rolando, and Joyce, I see that there are a lot of common things, common findings across the countries, like lack of resources has been one of the things that the participants share, most of the participants shared, and also focusing, talking about a specialist teacher or a medical doctor when we talked about inclusion and all the things has been a case even in Bhutan. And also when it comes to applicability of the findings from our research, first thing I think the main significance of our research is that there has not been many research, or I would say this could be the first research done in the area of similar research. And also one of the issues that Bhutan is facing at the moment is that our policymakers or even the practitioners, they do not have much understanding and disability, and they're quite often they're confused, and they think that it's more of same thing. Quite often, when they talk about inclusion, it's always about people with disabilities. So findings are capturing understanding of inclusion and disability, which is about Buddhist people straight from them. I think it is good for, it's quite important, and also to build up, you know, further research. So and so based on the findings, I think we recommend that there should be more focus on teacher preparedness as a way to move inclusion forward, and also working on how do you say now, working on awareness programs like carrying out similar research, as well as talking about inclusion, and doing things like, you know, talking about inclusion, talking about disabilities, and also bringing in people who are interested in this area, and then carrying out other works as well. And another significant contribution from the findings of our research is that we are able to tell people, you know, the differences between what's there in the policy and what they believe, and also how they are understanding, you know, how they understand disability, how they conceptualize disability and inclusion can have impact on the practice. For instance, we through literature and also through our interview, we found out that you know, when people look at disability from medical perspective, more from medical perspective, the focus could be more on you know, on the medical side. For instance, like giving treatment to those people with disabilities, instead of focusing on creating the environment or creating more inclusive environment. So these are some of the, you know, key findings and recommendations. If anyone has got things to add, I would pass back to Andrea.
Thank you, Dawa. And I think you know, all these studies highlight a number of different challenges. And but for example, as Rolando mentioned, and Rolando just left because he
Thank
had
you.
to run for a meeting. But as Rolando mentioned, there are also some opportunities out there. And also maybe to respond to Leda's question, I think we need to.
Can you hear me, Andrea?
Okay, sorry. Yes, Dawa, can you hear me? I think Dawa may have some problems with the internet connection. So what I was saying is
Can you
that
hear me?
yes, can you hear us? Okay, so I think one thing we need to be clear with is that all these studies are very specific.
Are you still
As
there? Can you hear me?
yes, Dawa. Let me send a message in chat. Dawa,
Hello.
we can hear you. Sorry about that. I think we need to be clear that all these studies have been conducted in very specific contexts, and so as Leda said, a lot of these results probably are just very much contextual. And from a purely research point of view, we need to, you know, they were fairly. I think all of the studies were fairly small scale qualitative pieces of research, and so from a purely academic perspective, the findings are probably have, you know, there's limitation in the replicability and applicability to other contexts of these findings. And I see Leda, you need to activate your mic. You need to activate your mic. Right.
Yes, I would like to disagree with you
Okay.
because the main argument of the book is that this type of small-scale qualitative research can teach us a lot more about a specific context as opposed to a, say, survey or a research using a standardized instrument. Because it is context sensitive research and very reflective. So I think we managed to get a snapshot, but of very, very rich information about each of the contexts. And I see a lot of value in that in terms of advancing the debate on inclusive education in the global south. That's what I was saying earlier. But obviously, because of the small sample, I think that some of these studies may not have been, for example, published in a very scientific academic journal, if that's what you're saying, because journals like numbers sometimes. So depending on the journal, obviously. But I don't think it's less rigorous, and I don't think we should be concerned that it can't be generalized or all research has limitations. I think for the purpose of what we were doing, that research was the suitable type of research to adopt.
Absolutely. And I also agree with what you said at the beginning, that more qualitative research is needed, particularly from the specific context, from Global South countries, and possibly as much as possible from Global South researchers. And hopefully, with more and more research coming in, this will form a pool of evidence. And while some of these studies will still be small scales, we will be able to identify patterns, as we already did during this conversation. So, for example, we heard about the divide between urban and rural. We heard about the lack of resources and the issue with training and the frustration sometimes with teachers, which I think is fairly cross-cutting across the studies. And for example, Dawa talked about karma, which is maybe a very specific thing for Bhutan and from other countries in that area. But the stereotypes that people associate to disability are quite common in a lot of other countries. And for example, even in the African context, there's a lot of stigma associated to disability. And that's an area in which we absolutely need to work. And at the same time, there's also positive attitude that was found in this study, and the idea that, yes, we want to be more inclusive, please help us, please give us resources. So I think that's, to that level, I think there's a lot of cross-cutting learnings, and there's a lot of findings that can sort of be applied elsewhere. And for example, from the study in Malaysia, I think it's also very important not just to look at one component, but also to look at different components and how they are interlinked. So for example, in this study in Malaysia, we specifically look at deafness and ethnicity, but we also looked at other identity aspects, for example, gender, for example, religion and the employment status, etc. And then what you get is a very complex map of all the factors that influence their sense of identity and their ability to participate in society on an equal basis with others. And I think that's very important, particularly in the education in the education sector, because girls with disabilities face different types of barriers, and very often more barriers than boys with disabilities. And so that has to be incorporated as well, and that has to be taken into account. I think we're almost at the end of our time today. I don't know if any of the panelists want to say a final word before we leave. Leda?
Just to wrap up and say what a great experience this has been, to have this sort of collaboration, because maybe it's something we didn't explain, but it is explained in the book that all four of you were graduates of the master's degree that I was coordinating at the university, and it was an excellent opportunity, that book, for us to, in a way, continue our collaboration past your graduation date. And I just felt this was a unique learning experience for me, and I hope for you guys as well. It was a steep curve, because we were we were doing a lot of other things at the same time. All of us are very busy, but I'm very, very happy that we've made it happen. We've persevered, and we all worked hard. And just to say how much this has enriched my research, and I've enjoyed the experience, although It was quite exhausting.
Dawa, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I think I would say that this experience was very enriching, as Leda said, because for me personally, I think it gave me opportunity to apply or use the things that I've learned, use the experience that I've gained through the master's degree program, and then come back to Bhutan and then really look at the work that I've done and apply some of the skills and really be part of the research that I've worked on as my thesis. And yeah, so it really helped me further my research skills and also to get in people very in-depth understanding of how people conceptualize or how people understand concepts such as disability and inclusion. And so yeah, very very rich experience, and I'm really happy that I've been part of this, and I would like to thank Leda and other team members here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawa. Joyce, any final word?
Likewise, I find that the experience post Erasmus has been very enriching. I find that the exposure with research and the collaboration between Leda and you all has given me deeper insight about what research really entails, and just to be able to share my skills going back to my own country. I was able to integrate my research skills in my lectures, and I found that there is a great demand for teachers to become exposed to basic research skills. And I think that the Erasmus Mundus program was able to provide that platform. And I think that was one of the best outputs that I was able to take from the program. And I couldn't have done it without Leda's mentorship, Leda's dedication. And like I said, I look forward to more collaboration with her and the team.
It was teamwork.
Teamwork.
Yeah, and also from my side, I'd just like to thank Leda and all the others, because there was a lot of effort that went into this book, and I think it's a great result. It's out there. It will contribute to raise more awareness and provide some evidence on what works and what doesn't in different contexts. I would like to thank all the panelists for joining us today and for sharing with us their insights. If you are watching this video, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. A link will be shared on our platform, which is globi-observatory.org. We'll share it on Twitter. There will be a Twitter chat with the hashtag inclusive dev chat. We'll share more information about it. And at the bottom of this video, you will find a link to the book in case you want to find out more and read it. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Sorry, Andrea,
yes?
Can we also share the discount code? So can we also do that through
Go for
Twitter? It. Yep. Okay. So we can share it.
We'll add it in the link.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
So thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you enjoy it, and see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.